Bom, Jason, eu queria começar com uma provocação sobre a questão das comunidades de aprendizagem pessoal. Muito interessante o conceito. Eu estou pensando enquanto professor de educação básica, enquanto professor de escola pública. Como é que nós podemos formar essas comunidades? Elas precisam necessariamente ser com os professores da mesma escola. Então, eu tenho necessidade e dentro da vivência escolar, dentro desse meu dia a dia do trabalho, eu não consigo encontrar, não sei exatamente por onde começar. E encontrar essa maestria, essa mentoria, encontrar alguém para poder acompanhar e trabalhar junto comigo nas comunidades de aprendizagem pessoal. E ainda mais uma provocaçãozinha, qual que seria o papel das universidades, das escolas de formação de professor nessas comunidades? Elas têm algum papel ou não? Ou elas não precisam participar dessas comunidades?
So certainly when it comes to trying to understand how personal learning communities specifically impact teachers, I think what we find is that first there's an element of time. So everything in a teacher's life is really about how much you can actually cram into a very, very busy day. And so trying to think about how do you create the instructional space for something like that is really priority number one. What I think we found is that there are a lot of self-organizing teachers that are able to find 2 or 3, 4 or 5 people within their school. It's harder to do across school, but certainly that's something where technology can help. But I think it's harder to do across school because you really want to focus on what are the outcomes from your kids in that conversation that you're trying to focus on for that community. And so what we find is if you have 2 or 3 or 4 folks within that environment, within that school, who can structure a conversation, in that case, often the facilitation can be whatever teachers find as their area of expertise. So if you're working on questioning strategies, or if you're working on very specific elements of rigor, or very specific elements of social emotional learning, grit, growth mindset, right? Each teacher can take on one of those skills and become their own, kind of mini facilitator for that, and that helps share some of the burden across how teachers think about that. But it doesn't necessarily require a massive amount of additional work. Certainly, the more you have an expert facilitator, so if you have access to coaches, if you have access to other people who can provide that sort of facilitation, that's very helpful. That's obviously not the environment that every teacher's in, and so it's about trying to make do with what you can. But I would argue that even having very purposeful conversations about outcomes for kids and how those structures are related to what you're teaching in the classroom and trying to think in a more formative way about what practice looks like, that's going to be a really powerful conversation. From the university perspective, I think it's really hard for universities to maintain that relationship with their teachers long term. And so we've had some universities now, and we talked a little bit about this right before we came here, where the universities, the teacher prep programs, they have started to really think about their life of their teachers over the course of after they graduate, after they go out into the real world. And so how can they support them in that next step, in that next phase? And I think that sort of support will help tie them back in. But historically, there haven't been a lot of ties. A teacher can be involved in their alumni group for their university, but there's otherwise not a lot of ties and a lot of incentives for universities to pay attention to what happens after their teachers leave because they're outside of the system then. And so it's about trying to make sure that we tie those things back together and create opportunities for that.
Você tem, para poder colaborar, para poder compartilhar com a gente aqui algum exemplo dessas comunidades, de como elas têm funcionado já em algumas escolas americanas, no contato que você tem com as escolas americanas, o impacto que isso tem gerado? Você tem recebido feedback dos professores americanos em relação a isso?
Sure. So one of the ones that we did a research study with a usability study last year for about a full year of interviewing teachers around personal learning communities and how they impact us. We actually brought in an expert who had run Pearson's Learning Teams group, who was one of the foremost experts in the world on personal learning communities. And so with her and with this team of engineers and some user experience designers, talked with lots of teachers about how they go through this process, and it's really interesting. So one of the examples was project-based learning. So there were a set of 3 or 4 teachers who really wanted to be able to incorporate more project-based learning into their classrooms, and they had never done so before, and so they didn't have a ton of great examples. None of the 4 of them have actually really done that, and so what they did is they reached out to a Stanford professor who had done some of this, and so with the Buck Institute, which is a project-based learning organization, who was willing to just give them and sit in their hour-long session that they had created for themselves and dial in by phone, and so they had a conversation about what they were currently doing in terms of projects for their students, what that would look like in terms of leveraging the expertise of this project-based learning expert, and then talked about how they might be able to then produce some sort of outcome in their next session. So whether that's next week, whether that's 2 weeks from now, whenever they got back together, how are they accountable to each other to produce some sort of result that said, well, here's what we're going to learn, here's how we're going to try it out. And so that sort of iterative cycle, it's what you find, I think, in a lot of ways around just the formative assessment mechanism is how do you think about the plan, teach, reflect cycle, and if you learn as much as you can about a topic, project-based learning in this case, then you try it out, and sometimes it totally fails, and so I think the teachers learned potentially more from each other talking about when it went awful, which is a really, those are good cathartic conversations to have for teachers, but it's about how do you share those examples and feel like you have a trusting space to share those. But then watching now, once you have that feedback, once you get some evidence back from other teachers and some perspective back from other teachers, how do you then improve your practice for the next cycle and for that next round? And so that sort of cycle of inquiry, that sort of personal learning community structured in a very facilitated sort of way, I think is what we find is really impactful in terms of those teachers then feeling like over a matter of 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks that they've become much, much more proficient, much, much more comfortable with the idea of project-based learning, even though they're starting from a place of very little knowledge.
Talvez seja importante na própria formação inicial, né, quando esse professor está começando a se estudar, a se formar enquanto professor ainda, essa prática do diálogo, né, já está presente na formação dele. Ele já se formar no seu processo enquanto futuro professor, habituado a esse diálogo, habituado a compartilhar dúvidas, compartilhar angústias e trabalhando em parceria, trabalhando colaborativamente com os seus colegas, né? Essa é uma visão que parece bastante lúcida e bastante produtiva, né? Esse professor que, desde o começo, enquanto ele está ali na universidade, nesse primeiro momento dele, ele aprenda que ele não deve e não tem de trabalhar sozinho. Ele precisa trabalhar em parceria para que ele chegue no mercado de trabalho, ele chegue na escola e ele possa, ele tenha referências de como ele trabalha assim em parceria ou trabalha em grupos, né?
Yeah, and I think this is where we find things like video being really, really important. And so in teacher prep programs, certainly in the US, and I don't have enough context for how they're structured in Brazil, but the idea of the way teacher prep programs are starting to work is that there's a lot of film and there's a lot of video being used. And so it's about encouraging teachers to be very comfortable seeing each other's practice and looking at film. And there's this very interesting demographic shift that we're starting to see. So there's already a demographic shift, and again, this is more US specific, but around younger teachers, given the turnover, younger teachers becoming more prolific, and then you have an older set of teachers in terms of demographics. The younger teachers that are coming into the system, right, if you ask anyone under the age of 18 right now how they learn anything, so anybody over 18, if you ask how they learn something, they'll most often tell you something like, oh, I'll get lessons. Which is fairly standard. So how do you learn to play guitar? Oh, I get lessons, I do, this is the way it works. Anybody under 18, if you ask them how they learn something, their answer is YouTube. And so the idea of watching video and learning from it is just normal, and they don't think about, it's almost insulting to say, like, why would I need lessons? I can go watch something, I can watch someone else do this. And so that sort of mechanism and how to embrace that in our universities is something that's really exciting. And also will be something that I think will help accelerate a lot of these sorts of conversations because the teachers that are coming into the profession are just more comfortable with that sort of process.
Aproveitando que estamos falando de vídeo, tem aqui uma pergunta pelo Twitter de alguém em algum lugar no mundo no momento. Como trazer o feedback em vídeo para a educação. Então, acho que a pessoa gostaria de ouvir um pouco mais de detalhes de como trabalhar com o feedback em vídeo para a educação. Então, com a colaboração, pelo que eu entendi, a colaboração do feedback em vídeo para esse professor, para essa formação continuada do professor.
So I think it's really about capturing what's happening in a classroom. And right now, video is okay. So the capture part of video is still hard. And I used to joke that we were, 4 or 5 generations of your iPhone away from having it. We're still probably 2 generations of your iPhone away to really having the level of sound quality that you would need to be able to kind of have the video quality is there. It's really the sound quality that's hard. But I think the capture mechanisms are there. It's, again, just about the time. It takes a long time. If you're capturing a 20-minute segment of a lesson, it takes a long time to then sit down and, one, want to go through that lesson and watch it with some colleagues, and 2, have somebody to go review that and really think about and put in the effort to talk about what that looks like. It's a time investment. And so it's really about how do you create space for that time. The technology will get there, and in 2 versions of your iPad, like I said, 2 versions of your iPad, the sound quality, there's now robots that will track teachers around the classroom, called a swivel that a lot of people use. And there's really interesting, innovative ways to capture what's happening in classrooms. And so now it's just about, can we create the time and the mechanisms necessary to be able to share out and have those really critical conversations? Because you can do it. And again, every other performance-based profession does this. And so it's about using that sort of work that's already being done to just leverage in terms of how do we apply it to teachers.
Falando um pouquinho dessa formação continuada também, especialmente aqui no Brasil, a gente tem uma tradição de diversas instituições ofertarem cursos de formação continuada, sejam cursos já autotutoriados ou sejam cursos com mediadores, com tutoria, seja online ou seja presencial, cursos para que o professor continue estudando. Você consegue encontrar espaço para essa tradição de cursos de formação continuada nessa outra visão de capacitação dos professores, especialmente se a gente pensar aí nessas comunidades, essas comunidades de trabalho com os professores?
I absolutely think there is, and I think it's those institutions that are providing those sorts of courses are critical to that process. It's really about restructuring the conversation about what's happening in those courses to be focused on the competencies that matter most. And I think there just hasn't been a lot of data, and there's still a lot of conversations about what those competencies should be. But I think we have the institutions, we have the credit systems in place. It's now about how do we reframe that conversation to be focused on what the competency looks like, what does demonstrating that competency mean, and how do you actually think about that process. And so I think the ideal scenario is the colleges and the schools of ed that are providing the certification, providing those sort of continuing education credits, they're able to really think about how to reframe the content that they're engaging, to reframe that in a very specific competency-based approach, so that it's less about getting your master's degree or your PhD, it's less about getting your salary increase because you got that degree, and it's more about understanding what does it mean to demonstrate mastery so that you got the salary increase because you demonstrated mastery, not because you sat in a seat.
Conta um pouco para a gente, então, do trabalho que a Bloomboard tem feito, contar para o público aqui o que é a Bloomboard e como que vocês têm colaborado, então, para essa capacitação dos professores.
Sure. So we're in the United States. We provide a lot of the teacher effectiveness platforms at a couple of different state levels. So we have 5 different state level contracts. And the idea is that we're really doing 2 sides of the equation for teacher effectiveness. One is we're collecting evidence of practice. So we're the platform for people to collect all the observation data, notes, ratings, evidence of how teachers are doing. We then take that data and we use it to make personalized recommendations in kind of like Amazon to an entire marketplace of content providers. So we have about 100 different content providers. We use the data we have, and if you think about it, if Amazon can make recommendations for you as a shopper based on a relatively limited data set about who you are, it's kind of eerie how good they can do it. If we have your observation data and your student performance data and your demographic data, we should actually be able to make much better recommendations as to how to help you improve. And so that's really where we focus it. We also spend a lot of time in our schools and in our districts really focused on making sure the conversation is not one of punitive, what do you do in an evaluation context, but it's about how do you structure a feedback conversation for a teacher so that it's always focused on support. And I think a lot of the U.S. system, that's where the U.S. system has gone wrong and the teacher evaluation side is that it feels very punitive in many contexts because teachers are getting evaluated and they're getting force ranked, but there's no support in terms of what the outcome is, and it undermines the entire process. And so it's about how do you have good critical conversations with teachers about practice, but how do you make sure that that's anchored in very personalized support to try and drive the best outcomes and the best approach for improving teachers.
Tem uma pergunta aqui do Guilherme, da Lehman, também acho que bastante provocativa. Deve-se dar autonomia para os professores e as escolas que têm performance mais baixa para que eles possam repensar as necessidades deles, ou você acredita que é necessário uma intervenção realmente de alguém de fora para essas escolas e esses professores com baixo rendimento?
Wow, so that's not a softball question. So it's a great question. I think it's very clear that where you have lots of struggling students, the way the systems are structured right now is that you find your master teachers do not find their ways into the most struggling schools. And so you have a very clear misalignment of the best teachers teaching the best kids, and therefore you don't have the structures in place and you don't have the mastery in place that would really help those teachers who then want to be empowered and really own their practice. They just don't have support. And so I think it's really hard to think you can create that sort of autonomy. You have to have a balance of all of them. And so when thinking about what it means for a low-income school, what it means for a really underperforming environment, you have to be able to bring in that sort of expertise to then be able to help create that sort of autonomy. Because if you don't have expertise and you create autonomy, you'll just create havoc. But if you can bring in that expertise, then you can actually still have autonomy for teachers and let those teachers respond to the needs of their kids. But you've got to have that expertise there. You've got to be able to find that. And so there's a lot of work trying to be done around how do you create that sort of teaching force that can be dispersed across your lowest performing and your highest performing students so that you have examples of mastery in those classrooms? Or how do you bring in mastery from outside, whether it's using technology, whether it's using other systems, to really support teachers most? And so I think that's really the key is how do you bring in that, once you have the mechanism in place to understand what that competency should be, how do you bring in mastery to then be able to create the levels of autonomy that are helpful?
Com muito diálogo também, né? Porque é importante que quem está ali dentro da escola, que sabe quais são as necessidades, que sente, que muitas vezes também não consegue perceber quais são todos os problemas, mas que sente e visualiza e tem a experiência dos problemas ali, pode e deve contribuir para traçar esse plano de melhoria, né? É muito complicado, realmente, alguém vir de fora e dizer, olha, vocês precisam fazer isso, isso e isso, né? Tem mais uma aqui provocativa do Guilherme. Qual seria, então, o papel dos diretores ou dos gestores das escolas nesse processo? Você enxerga os diretores da escola também envolvidos nesse processo? E qual deve ser o papel deles?
I would actually argue that principals are probably the most important person in the process. Where you find, the reality is if you look across, and again, this is the US context, if you look across where you have great schools, I will show you great leaders. And it's just foundational in that really good principals are able to create the conditions for great instruction. And so principals have to be, I would say I probably, going back several years, I probably would have put more priority on what administrators and what the school system leaders actually can do. But at the end of the day, it turns out it's just really hard for even those folks to get stuff down into schools, in that the critical person in terms of reform and impact is how well your principal feels like they have the same set of autonomy, the same set of mastery, and the same set of abilities to work within the system to create those sorts of conditions. And so I would say principals are the most important element of that. And unfortunately, the system is not structured to provide principals support. And they are a smaller, from the economic standpoint, they're just a smaller user base. And so there aren't companies focused on principals training, by and large, because it's not a big enough market for them to make money on it. And so we struggle even as a company trying to aggregate all the content that trains people and helps teachers and helps educators grow. We struggle trying to find leadership content because there's just not a lot out there because it hasn't been a big enough market. And so I think it is one of those really critical elements that's missing in the system the way it's structured today, that we've got to figure out better ways and better competencies for principals to help create those conditions, because they are absolutely the kind of a foundational element of it, but they just don't get the support in the same way that they need.
Tem uma pergunta aqui da Camila, do Instituto Telos. Como engajar a sociedade na formação dos professores? Pensando em como engajar esse professor, como engajá-lo a gravar as próprias aulas, como empoderar a sociedade para que ela se importe e crie motivações para realmente mudar a educação. Então, a gente tem muitas vezes um contexto no professor desmotivado, um professor que enfrenta muitos problemas na escola, como a gente conversou agora há pouco, às vezes ele se sente sozinho, e como engajá-lo a realmente dar esse passo adiante, e há algo que outros elementos da comunidade escolar ou da sociedade podem fazer para ajudar esse professor a motivá-lo, já que motivação é uma palavra muito importante também na sua fala?
Sure, I would say it still goes back to those three foundational premises, which is the way to engage teachers, and there are lots of teachers who feel very undermined and feel like they are demotivated because of the systems in which they live. But I think the way to really help motivate those teachers is by creating a sense of autonomy, mastery, and purpose, and being able to do that and leverage the systems in place for that process. It's very clear that teachers don't feel like they have either the needs or the requirements, or that they're respected in their professions. And so trying to think about what sort of leadership is in place for that, and what sort of mechanisms that you use from both a societal standpoint, as how we think about the profession of educators. There are not, certainly in the US, educators are not viewed kindly by the broader country, and it's a tragedy when you think about relative to other professions and relative to the people in the profession. And so I think a lot of work needs to be done on helping both elevate that status as a profession, treating teachers with the sort of autonomy that they deserve and the sort of professionalism that they deserve, but also then being able to create the set of conversations and the set of ways to empower their growth and their systems to really respond to that. Because right now the system is not structured for them to feel like they are respected, and that's what's demotivating. And so I think a lot of the paths that we're working on, and a lot of the paths that are out here in terms of these motivational factors, are driving towards that, is what would that system look like? And what are the small changes that you can make to start to create that sort of mechanism in place where people feel like they have that sort of engagement?
A Raquel Volpato, que é da Secretaria Estadual de Educação aqui de São Paulo, tem uma pergunta dirigida a você, mas que eu também vou tomar a liberdade de poder falar um pouco, porque ela vai falar da formação inicial das agências, que são importantes, são fundamentais na formação inicial, nas universidades e faculdades, e ela coloca uma provocação aqui, acho que para a gente, para todos. As universidades, agências formadoras não serão intimadas a se atualizarem. Então, a escola de formação de professores também não precisa se atualizar. Acho que isso está um pouco presente aí na sua fala, no que a gente conversou. Acho que é fundamental que as escolas formadoras de professores se olhem, se gravem, façam vídeos das suas aulas também, né, se analisem e percebam se o que ela está ofertando, se o professor que ela está formando realmente é o professor que a sociedade precisa, que a sociedade necessita, tá? Se é a demanda do momento. Então, essa é isso é uma questão complicada para a universidade, que tem, a gente estava conversando agora há pouco, antes de subir ao palco, né, que tem um ritmo próprio, que tem existem outras questões acadêmicas envolvidas, mas eu vejo como fundamental que a universidade realmente se aproxime mais da escola, dos problemas da escola, nesse seu processo de formação. Não sei se tem algo a mais que eu gostaria de comentar também, isso é um pouco o meu ponto de vista.
So I would certainly agree. I think we've seen, even in the last couple of years, probably the last 18 months, we've seen a lot of movement from schools of ed in trying to push these sorts of new policies and these sorts of new approaches. I think mainly because the demand from teachers is very clear, and the universities are just not the fastest moving organizations, and they may be towards the slower end of the moving organizations, and so that's taken a while, but they are very critical in that process, and so trying to figure out how to help aggregate the experience for those folks, and how do you think about leveraging each other so that they can create a little bit, so they can make that process easier on each other is very important, because they do need to help get there. They will be a critical part of it, and it will only take longer the longer it takes.
Tem uma pergunta do outro Guilherme, da Fundação Lema. Quais os desafios na criação de microcredenciais?
So I think the biggest challenge we have right now is agreeing on the taxonomy, so agreeing on the competencies, or rather, I would actually argue that we don't need to agree on the competencies, but we need to agree on just some competencies. Because the really exciting thing about moving to a competency-based model is that you all of a sudden create a fluid system that is not rigid in how you think about it. And so right now, the way, certainly in the US and I think in many countries, the way teaching is defined is, here are the set of 35 skills, here's the Charlotte Danielson framework for teaching and learning, here's the set of skills. The moment you start to create a mechanism where teachers can define mastery in their own classrooms, it allows you to very quickly incorporate innovation in things like growth mindset, in things like grit, in things like perseverance. And that sort of fluid nature of what the teaching profession looks like is a massive change to what researchers and education folks and policy folks have ever had. And so the idea that you can agree to, there is a set of competencies that are needed, and that set should be defined, and that set should be somewhat agreed upon. But even if there isn't universal agreement, we should just go. And then you should let teachers demonstrate mastery for whatever that set of competencies. And you need some sort of rigorous clearing mechanism. So in the US, we're working with a couple of different organizations that can provide that sort of independent third-party rigor that says, here's what we're actually trying to do, here's the bar for what competency should be and what that should demonstrate. But you need something like that in terms of how to define what a competency, what mastery is. But once we have that, we don't need to work for perfection. I think there is a lot, especially in the research community, there's a lot of perfection is the enemy of the good. And so trying to think about how we just keep going and iterate and be faster with it, and make sure that there's good checks in place, that's really going to be the key.
Agradeço imensamente a sua colaboração, Jason, aqui nesse tema que continua bastante atual, né? A questão da formação do professor. A gente não pode parar de pensar nisso.
Thank you very much. Obrigado.